in almost all cases. But there's nothing specific about abuse. It's just a more extreme form of not being seen. No, I'm not minimizing the impact of it. I'm just saying it's the most extreme version of something that many people in this society experience, because this society as a whole does not value human beings for who they are. Now, if you've read the book Tuesdays with Morrie, which is about a guy with ALS, Morrie, and his student Mitch, he's a former teacher, and Mitch finds out that Morrie has ALS, and which is a fatal neurological disorder, Lou Gehrig's disease in North America, because the great baseball player died of it. So Mitch, the student, begins to visit Morrie every Tuesday, and they have these conversations, which in the end he writes down, and they decide that Morrie's teachings, as he's dying, will be transmitted to the world. But what is really telling is what Morrie says as to why he wants to pass his wisdom on to the world. Now, those of you that read the book, anybody recall what he says? It's very, very revealing of our social state of mind. Do you remember what he said? He says, I want to pass my wisdom on to the world because I want to prove that dying people aren't useless. Now, what do you make of that?
I love that.
Do you? Do you think anybody's useless? Do you think dying people are useless? Do you think any human being is useless? Where did Morrie get the idea that anybody's useless? In other words, that's a social statement. That's a statement of an economically based society where it's what you produce and what you own or what you consume is what defines your value. So you can't separate the individual from the social context. And Morrie, by the way, was addicted not to drugs, but to being good and nice all the time. And that's why he develops ALS, by the way. If you want to know about that, you can read my book, When the Body Says No, which is about the mind-body unity in health and illness. But the point I'm making is that it's very pervasive. The addiction to having our needs or that emptiness filled from the outside is pervasive in our society, whether people do drugs or behaviors is a matter of degree and is a matter of individual predisposition and circumstance, but the fundamental fact is that desperation to fill the emptiness and that fear of being alone with your own mind, even for 1 second, is absolutely pervasive in our culture, which is what you see in the constant stimulation that's coming at you all the time. People are terrified to be with themselves even for a second. Now the addict is terrified to be with themselves. So it's that feeling of the emptiness. And the Catholic monk, Thomas Merton, whose biography I'm just reading, he's a really wonderful writer. And he says, and I believe I can find the right page for this too. Yeah, he's talking about the materialistic society. And I'm planning a book right now. The title will be Toxic Culture. How materialistic society makes us sick. And here's what Merton says in the 1940s. It is true that the materialistic society, the so-called culture that has evolved under the tender mercies of capitalism, has produced what seems to be the ultimate limit of worldliness, of seeking material goods, that is. And nowhere, except perhaps in the society of pagan Rome, has there ever been a flowering of cheap and petty and disgusting lusts and vanities as in the world of capitalism, where there's no evil that is not fostered and encouraged for the sake of making money. Think of the reality television shows. We live in a society whose whole policy is to excite every nerve in the human body and keep it at the highest pitch of artificial tension, to strain every human desire to the limit, and to create as many new desires and synthetic passions as possible in order to cater to them with the products of our factories and printing presses and movie studios and all the rest. So in the context of a society like that, which furthermore, and particularly in the United States, completely dishonors the role of parenting and completely undermines the necessary attachment relationships between parents and children, you're going to have a lot of addicts. A lot of kids are going to go feeling empty. I mean, what do you expect in a country where the average maternity leave unpaid 6 weeks long. In civilized countries, they provide paternity leaves. Never mind maternity leave. So in a context like that, people lose contact with themselves. And as the same spiritual teacher says, if I can find this quote. Well, I won't find it. I won't look for it now. But he says that I got it actually. He's talking about the fundamental loss that we all experience, and he says the fundamental thing that happened, and the greatest calamity is not that there was no love or support. So radical as it seems to say this, but the fact of loss of connection with the parents, not being seen, even being abused, is not the fundamental tragedy, he says. The greater calamity, which was caused by that first calamity, is that you lost the connection to your essence. That is much more important than whether or not your father or mother loved you. And so that loss of essence then is what creates that emptiness, which we then try and fill with all the addictive behaviors and substances. And then when we recover, what do we find? We find that very essence that we lost so long ago. Now, of course, it's more complicated than that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist on the brain level. Of course it does. The addicted brain is afflicted by the very fact of addiction, by what the drugs or compulsive behaviors do to the brain. And they actually cause brain damage. So that the recovery process is also one of physically reclaiming your brain. And it doesn't take 3 weeks. You know, it's a long process. But apart from that brain which became addicted wasn't right in the first place. So we have this myth again that drugs are addictive. Well, obviously drugs are not addictive, are they? If I ask you this question, is alcohol addictive? Is it? Well, if I ask you this question, in fact I will ask it. How many of you had a glass of wine or beer in your life, ever? One. Okay? And out of those, how many are willing to say that they've had a drinking problem? Now, a much smaller number. If the alcohol was addictive in itself, you should all be alcoholics, right? So the addiction is not in the alcohol. Most people who try heroin or cocaine or crystal meth, even a powerful drug is crystal meth, even repeatedly, never become addicted. Which is not to say that I'm not advocating that you should use them. I'm just saying that it takes not just the drug, but the drug in combination with a susceptible individual. And the question is what creates the susceptibility? So what creates the susceptibility on the physiological level, on the brain level, then is those early adverse childhood experiences, because it turns out that the human brain develops under the influence of the environment. And so if you're looking at right now, you've got this epidemic in North America of children being diagnosed with all these disorders. ADHD, which by the way, I was diagnosed not as a child, but at age 54. Oppositional defiant disorder, Tourette's, autism, you know, the numbers are just burgeoning, and millions of kids are being medicated. And by the way, millions and millions of kids are being medicated, and some of them with medications that we don't even know if they're safe to give to children, because the studies have not been done, and they can cause terrible side effects. But we think that there's this epidemic of all these childhood diseases going on, but what's really going on is that the conditions for healthy brain development are not there anymore. Because for healthy brain development, you need the presence of emotionally available, nurturing, parenting caregivers, consistently available. And to the extent that that's not available to kids, their brains may not develop properly. And then 5 years later, they're diagnosed with some kind of disorder. And the more stressed the parents are, the less the kid's brain has the chance of developing properly. Then they get some kind of disorder, which makes them more prone for addictions. So the susceptibility to addiction is not universal. And although in a culture like this, it becomes almost universal if you include all the addictions, the behaviors. But certainly the susceptibility to drugs is not universal, which means to say that the drugs are not in themselves addictive. It's a question of who's susceptible and why. And if you look at who's susceptible and why, it's those kids that had the worst conditions for brain development in the first place. I'm talking now about the severe drug addicts, the street corner drug addicts. These people were invariably abused, traumatized as kids. And it's that trauma then that misshapes the brain, which makes them more likely to use. So that, as a guy said to me in detox a couple of years ago, when I asked him what the heroin did for him, he said, you know, Doc, I can't tell you exactly, but the closest that can come, he says, is let's say you're sick as a kid and you're a 3-year-old and you're shivering, and your mother puts you on her lap and wraps you in a warm blanket and gives you some warm chicken soup. That's what the heroin feels like. What is he looking for? He's looking for love. And very specifically, the opiate drugs resemble our own brain chemicals, the endorphins, meaning endogenous morphine-like substance, and those endorphins actually have been called molecules of love. So the heroin addict is looking for love. What else is he looking for? He's looking for pain relief, because of course the opiates are powerful pain relievers. And of course, all the drugs are pain relievers. All the drugs are pain relievers. So that somebody's drunk too much, what do you say about them? You say he's feeling no pain. Which means that the real question of addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And if you understand people's pain, you can't look at their genes and you can't look at their choices, you have to look at their lives. So, to make a long story short then, it's that original pain and that original separation and that original emptiness then that the addiction comes along to try to soothe. The problem is that the same psychiatrist who said that addiction is always a question of trying to solve a problem, to remedy a problem through external means, he also said